Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Hello and good afternoon to everyone. On behalf of the Institute of Social and Policy Sciences, School Education Department, Government of Punjab, and Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, I welcome you all to this webinar. Thank you for taking out time and joining us. The webinar will look at the multigrade teaching and learning challenge in Punjab, which holds equally for other provinces of Pakistan as well. Not only we plan to uncover the state of multigrading in Punjab, but we'll also look at the potential solutions to address this situation by looking at the national and international practices. This webinar is a part of the larger effort of the School Education Department, FCDO and I-SAPS to develop a policy response to the multigrade challenge in the province. Multigrading basically is a phenomena where you have more than one grade sitting in a single classroom setting without teachers adequately trained to teach in such settings and adequate support mechanisms available to the students. These students are significantly disadvantaged compared with the students in monograde settings. So without further ado, I'll move to our keynote speakers and experts who are with us to discuss and deliberate upon the topic in detail. We are honored to have a great pool of experts joining us today for this webinar. So fingers crossed for a lively and an engaging session. So to begin the session, I'll request Dr. Angela Little to share with us her experiences regarding the multigrade challenge and learnings for improving the situation. Dr. Angela is a renowned international name when it comes to multigrade teaching and learning. Over her professional life, she has deeply studied the phenomena across the globe. We are honored to have Dr. Angela with us today, and I'll now request her to kindly share with us what she has learned studying the phenomena across the world and what learnings and considerations we should keep in mind while we work towards addressing the situation in Punjab. Over to you, Dr. Angela.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And it's my pleasure to be able to join you for this discussion. Titled Responding to the Challenges of Multigrade Teaching, Learning from Other Contexts, because of course you are the experts on the situation in the Punjab and I am not. So I'm going to share with you some of my experiences from several different parts of the globe. So what I want to do in this talk is to give you an overview of the meanings and the extent of multigrade education. Most of the talk describing the diversity of teaching and learning strategies in multigrade classrooms around the world. And then I will briefly speak about some of the research that has been done on the outcomes of multigrade teaching for children, both in terms of their cognitive outcomes and their non-cognitive outcomes. So let me start with a case from rural Sri Lanka. I think many years ago, and I don't think we would find this situation cropping up very often today, but this was an example of a two-teacher school, and unfortunately the second teacher had not yet arrived at the school. There was a problem with the bus bringing him. He was traveling 10 miles each day to the school. And so in the meantime, the other teacher was looking after the children. And there are children in this space, and this is a temporary shed. Actually, there was a temporary shed because there were some repairs being done to the main school building. And I think in this picture, there are actually 4 different grades working. And she has set them all tasks to work at. They're working in their graded groups. So I think we have here grade 3, 4, 5 and possibly grade 2 as well. And this was the early morning, and I think that's a fairly typical way of dividing the children up. So she put them into their grade groups and they work. So if we look at the research and the writing about multigrade teaching around the world, you will find that it is described in a slightly different way within different bodies of literature, so that if any of you are undertaking literature reviews on this subject, it's worth putting in the following keywords, because different countries use different words for the same. I mean, as I think you have already explained, Abdullah, to the teaching of different curriculum grades at the same time. It's also referred to sometimes as multiple class, composite class, a vertical group, mixed year classes, family classes, double classes, and the extreme case of a one-teacher school in the Latin American context has been described as a unitary school. So all of these terms. Now, if we just step back a moment and try and ask the question, how many children are learning in multigraded settings around the world? This is a very, very difficult figure to calculate or even to estimate. We know that around the world in primary education, there are about 750 million children enrolled, are approximately 59 million. Now, if we were to achieve 100% enrollment around the world, we would add the 750 to the 59, we'd get just over 800 million children. And this is a conservative estimate, if 20% of the 809 million of children are in multigraded classrooms, then curriculum developers and teacher educators need to develop for approximately 162 million. Now, I think that estimate of 20% of the world's children being in multigrade classrooms is a conservative estimate. And I know from the information that you have already shared with me about the Punjab, we know that 75% of children are enrolled in schools where there are 3 or fewer teachers. And that means in a 6th-graded primary system, that assuming that all children are engaged in learning during the whole of the day, for some part of the day, a very large number of children in the Punjab are de facto in multigrade classes. So I'm now going to describe briefly for you 2 broad categories of what I call teaching and curriculum strategies. The first is what I call quasi-monogrades. The teacher basically tries to treat the multigrade group as if it was monograded. And so she would do what I've already shown you in that photograph from Sri Lanka. She would divide the children into their graded groups, and then she would move around them and teach them as though they were a single grade. The second broad strategy builds on the pedagogic principle of differentiation means in a moment. So let's have a look at a few examples of quasi-monograde teaching. So the first example is from Nepal. This is a rural school in Nepal, and these are 2 grades of students in the upper grades of primary education. You can see it's a very, very small class, 3 children to the right, 6 children to the left in the next higher grade. And the teacher has set some work for the children on the right, and he's teaching the other children as though they were in just one grade, and they are in one grade. So he's moving between these two different groups, and it's as though he's got two monograded classrooms. Now, what I find interesting is the little boy in the right-hand group. You see he's actually listening to the teacher teaching. I think this happens quite a lot in multigraded settings. There's an awful lot going on in a classroom, and children are doing their own set tasks, but they're also listening in to what children in the other grade are doing. The second example of quasi-monograde, this is drawn from the Caribbean, from the Turks and Caicos Islands. There is only a very small number of primary schools on the Turks and Caicos. And what this teacher's doing, she has four columns of children, and each column is a different grade. So she's actually got 4 grades in this classroom, and you'll see she's got a very nice large double blackboard, and she's divided that up into 4 sections, and she's got 4 different sets of work going on for the very small groups of children in 4 different grades. So once again, she is treating them as 4 monograded classrooms in one space. Now, the third example of monograde. Now, this photograph I took in rural Vietnam, and it really was a remarkable class to observe. There was just one teacher in this classroom, and there were 5 grades. Again, you can see the numbers of students are very few, because it was a very, very remote rural village. And in this classroom, each own blackboard, and the teacher here is moving around the grade groups. It's not to say that the children were always in their grade groups, just doing their grade specific work. She did actually do a number of activities which involved the children as a whole group. But you can see in that image that she is working there with just one child, and that child was in grade 3. And when that child entered the school, he was the only child. He is actually moving through his entire 5 years of primary education, sitting on his own with his own blackboard. The following year, he would have moved up to the left to that blackboard on the left-hand side. I think this is a very, very extreme example of a monograded situation. But again, the way that the teacher divided the children was to kind of force them into a monograded reality. It's another example of I'm sorry, I've called this, the title here is a mistake. I've said quasi-multigrade. It's actually another example of quasi-monograde. But it's got an interesting twist in the strategy. I call it quasi-monograde with a multi-year curriculum. Now, this example is taken from the island of Rhodes in Greece, in the Mediterranean. And Greece is one of the very few countries education actually provides quite a lot of guidance to multigrade teachers. And that's because many of the children are studying on islands, very small islands, very, very rural settings. And a number of the teachers are multigraded teachers. Now, this school had 2 teachers, and the teacher you can see on the left, he was the school principal. And in this classroom, you've got 3 grades, 5 and 6, and they're the 2 groups at the back. You can only see half of the grade 6 who are at the back on the right. And then the small group at the front, they're grade 2. And the guidance that the multigrade principals are given in Greece is that you should combine grade 1, 3 and 4, and then grade 2, 5 and 6. And the reason for this is that they feel that grade 1 and grade 2 should a teacher and should be taught in their graded groups. Whereas by the time they get to 3 and 4, and certainly by the time they get to 5 and 6, they can be undertaking quite a lot of their learning together. Now, so grade 2 is treated as though it was monograded, but grade 5 and 6, they are taught all their subjects together as one group. So you combine the grade 5 and 6 and you teach them the same thing, subjects except mathematics. And in mathematics, they have a separate curriculum for grade 5 and a separate curriculum for grade 6. So grade 5 and 6 being taught together for everything except maths is an example of what we call a multi-year curriculum. It just means that you spread the curriculum across 2 years. And it also means that the children in grade 5 and the children in grade 6 actually start that 2 years. But it doesn't really matter because the nature of the tasks are suitable for both grade 5 and 6, and it doesn't matter at which point they dip into the syllabus, if you like. So that's a rather interesting example. Now, let me move to the second broad strategy that I call differentiation. And this is the idea that children can be doing different things and similar things at the same time. So this in Rajasthan in India, and it was an example of a very, very small school run by a non-governmental organization. And the language was, the lesson was language. And I watched this lesson, obviously because of the language, I couldn't follow it, but I could get the gist of what was happening. And the teacher basically read a story, and then she asked children questions about the bits of the story, and she formed her questions in relation to the age of the child. So she would ask much easier questions of the younger children and slightly more challenging questions of the older children. And basically, when they started to work individually, she gave them differentiated tasks. So the lesson started our story. The children stayed together, and she posed slightly different levels of question to the children of the different ages. And then when it came to the tasks and they were working on their chalkboards, she gave them different tasks to do in relation to the level of learning that they had reached. And it gave her quite a lot of time, in fact, to spend extra time with this really quite young girl who had only recently joined the school. And this comes from Ireland, and particularly in rural Ireland, because rural Ireland still has a very large proportion of schools that are multigraded. And this was a grammar lesson. It was a lesson in Irish Gaelic, one of the languages in Ireland. And again, this teacher had 4 grades in this classroom. You can see they're very, very well resourced. Each child. Now, those were the textbooks covering all the subjects, not just language. And again, she gave them a common input. They were all listening to the same input. But because the lesson was about grammar, she then posed questions to the different grade groups at different levels. So she differentiated the level at which she posed the questions, and then she set them to work on their tasks. I think most of their tasks involved a language work group to grade. So another example of differentiation. Here's another slightly different example of differentiation. This is taken from a school which is very close to where I live. I am a native of the Isle of Man, which is a very small island in the middle of the Irish Sea. Although I spent my career working at the University of London, I have now retired, and I've retired back to my island. This is the medium of Manx Gaelic as its medium of instruction, and I'm actually a governor of this school. This teacher here is dressed in the outfit of a beekeeper. So he's got his, he is actually a beekeeper. So he's telling the children all about beekeeping. He's wearing his mask. And he took the theme of beekeeping as a theme for his teaching, which spread over, I think, 3 weeks. Was related to beekeeping. The language they were doing was related to beekeeping. Now there are 3 different grades in this classroom, and he gave them the same input, the same sort of explanation of what he was wanting to tell them about. He actually gave them the same tasks, the same language tasks, and the same numeracy tasks, and same science tasks, but he differentiated from the children working at the different grade levels. So the lesson essentially was the same. The tasks, the instructions for the tasks were broadly the same, but the outcome, the assessment outcomes that he expected from the children were differentiated. So that's another example of differentiation in a multi-graded classroom. Now, this is another example of differentiation, what we might call graded. Comes from Latin America. It comes from the country of Colombia, and it's a program that some of you may have heard about. It's called Escuela Nueva. Escuela Nueva means new school, and it's not such a new scheme now. It's been going since the 1980s, but it has been gradually adapted over time. And this is an example of where differentiation goes right down to the level of the individual child. And an enormous amount of time was spent in creating materials for the children, which enable the children to work through the materials at their own pace. So it's very much an example of self-directed learning, but learning which is guided by the teacher, but very importantly, guided by high quality learning materials. And you can see the learning materials which are spread out on the table. But essentially, these 4 children are, they're all on different pages of the book. And things. Built into this strategy is a lot of peer learning and cooperative learning. As I've already said, the learning materials are graded, requires a lot of time by expert teachers, expert teacher educators, and particularly expert curriculum developers, and a lot of work that goes into the production of these materials for the schools. Also very important is a lot of self-assessment and teacher assessment. These are just small assessment tasks which, assuming that the child can achieve the assessment task and get it correct, then they're ready to move on to the next section of their learning materials. And basically the children assess themselves first, and then they take their assessment to the teacher for checking. A very similar program, but literally comes from the activity-based learning programs in Tamil Nadu in India. Again, this uses graded learning. All the materials are organized along what are called learning ladders. There's a common timetable for all children, so they're all doing maths at the same time or language at the same time. They have been using it with classes of between 30 and 60. Personally, I think that's very ambitious, perhaps too ambitious, but in some cases that's they've been doing. Training and support was necessary. It's been used in both urban and rural schools. The incredible thing about this program was that the Director of Education, together with the Minister of Education, decided that this was such a good pedagogy that all schools, even in the urban areas, even though they could be monograded schools, they all had to adopt this pedagogy, and they all had to combine at least 2 grades into a multigraded classroom. So this is an example of a pedagogy. Many of these schools could have continued to be monograded schools, but they all became multigraded schools. And this was, I think, about 59,000 schools in the state of Tamil Nadu. Okay, let me start drawing to a conclusion. So I've described what I call quasi-monograded strategies and differentiation strategies. The quasi-monograded strategies involve multiple groups, multiple and different inputs to the different grades. You can also find multi-year curriculum spans in quasi-monograde. The differentiated strategies are teacher-centered with same inputs, same or different tasks, same or different learning assessments. Or it can be a program like the Escuela Nueva and the activity-based learning, which is materials-centered, where you have graded materials for individual students. Very briefly, the research it's very hard, I think, to pronounce these findings in a very hard and fast way, because the studies were done in very different ways. But in industrialized country studies, on average, we find that students in multigrade and monograde classes tend to achieve at similar levels. And in the developing country studies, there is a slight trend towards higher achievement in the multigraded classrooms. And perhaps we can discuss that later. In social out-country studies, we found differences in friendship patterns, self-concept, altruism, and a positive attitude to school. But there was no difference or disadvantage in any of these dimensions for the multigrade students. Developing country studies, they've concentrated on self-esteem, self-confidence, these have shown advantages in the Escuela Nueva and in the activity-based learning, greater self-motivation. We can perhaps go into some of the detail of that later. Okay, so finally then, the key principles of a positive multigrade pedagogy. It places the learner at the center of learning, and it draws from what she or he knows and experience. It is inclusive. That is actually a principle of all good pedagogy, whether it's multigrade or monograde. The learner is at the center of a support system. Mentions the teacher, obviously, but graded learning materials of high quality, and the importance of other students being involved in peer and cooperative learning. Curriculum differentiation, I think, is key to a positive multigrade pedagogy, and formative assessment. I think I explained briefly how in the Escuela Nueva program, small assessments were built into the general learning routines, and only when a child had mastered particular tasks, slightly more difficult tasks. Conclusions then. So the challenge of multigrade teaching is that it should be turned into an opportunity to rethink curriculum, teaching and learning strategies to reach all children. Multigrade teaching should be viewed as a positive pedagogy, not a second-class pedagogy or a pedagogy of necessity. Multigrade pedagogies, I hope, in this very brief presentation that I've shown you, are very diverse. And finally, curriculum and material support, as well as teacher training. I can't emphasize this enough. I've seen many, many examples of ministries of education, departments of education, feeling that the only thing which multigrade teachers need is better teacher training. Teacher training is absolutely vital, but they need curriculum, the teachers need teachers' guides, and they need learning materials. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Angela. It was really insightful for us to see how multi-grading phenomena exist across the globe and what efforts have been made to tackle the situation. It was actually so interesting that I wanted to hear much more of it, but unfortunately we are bound by the time limit specified. We'll move on to later on to the audience in the plenary if they have any questions to ask from you. But for the time being, after this enlightening presentation, I'll now request my colleague Sham Adil to share with the audience the state of multigrade teaching and learning challenge facing Punjab and what the data and other things tell us. Sham is part of the team supporting the development of the multigrade policy for school education department and is member of the technical working group formed for the purpose. Over to you, Sham.
My name is Sham Adil and I work with the Institute of Social and Policy Sciences. And although this presentation is going to be largely about Punjab, but our colleagues from other provinces are likely to find that the situation about multigrade teaching very different. So we have two objectives of this presentation. First, we're going to present before you a review of current practices and processes in multigrade classrooms. And then we will present some moot points for our panelists to share their thoughts and their reflections. So let's start by first presenting the case of multigrade challenge in Punjab and why we think it should be treated as a challenge in the current situation. We all know how the curriculum is organized and it's structured. So for a given subject at a given grade level, the curriculum has a long list of themes, sub-themes, SLOs, and competencies that the students have to master within an academic year. And then there are curriculum materials which assist the teachers. These include scheme of studies, academic calendar, and all these things, which assist teachers in delivering. And this is what an academic year looks like. So in Punjab, we have around 216 days of teaching. But if we look closely, we find that the curriculum and curriculum materials, as Dr. Angela also mentioned, are based upon, even in Punjab, are based upon the assumption that each class will have one teacher and each teacher will have around 216 days to deliver the curriculum. This assumption holds for monograde class, multi-grade classrooms. In fact, the situation changes drastically if teachers try to deliver the same curriculum with the help of same curriculum materials to a multi-grade classroom. Well, primarily, the contact time, which was previously designated for one class, now ends up being distributed among two grades to complete the curriculum of two respective grade levels, assuming that the multi-grade classroom has combined two grades. Now, I would encourage all the participants to imagine for a moment what this means for the case of Punjab, where we already know that the quality of teaching and learning in our classrooms is not very high. And the situation becomes even more challenging considering the fact that our teachers are not equipped to deal with multi-grade classrooms. And when they try to get support from their school leaders, head teachers, and education managers, they do not have any success because they also face considerable challenge. They have considerable capacity deficits in terms of managing multi-grade classrooms. Now, if multi-grade is such a big challenge, the question is, what is the incidence of multi-grade teaching in Punjab? And the short answer to this question is that we do not have the data at the moment to answer this question. At the moment, we don't know which schools have multi-grade teaching. We don't know which grades are being clubbed together. We don't know who are teaching those grades. We don't know if those teachers have adequate training. So there are a whole lot of questions we don't know anything about. In the absence of the data, we have proxy indicators to help us measure the incidence of multigrade teaching. Now, proxy indicators come with their own set of challenges. So in this case, the proxy indicator might be exact incidence of multigrade teaching in Punjab, but it can nevertheless help us understand the magnitude of challenge in the province. So we have used the number of teachers for primary schools. The assumption is that a primary school which has 6 grades should have 6 teachers, 1 teacher for every grade. And in case of any school where the number of teachers is less than 6, we can assume that multigrade teaching is present in some form in that school. And going by that standard, we somehow find that there are around 80% of the schools which have less than 6 teachers. There's a big caveat is that primary schools are also allowed to have part-time coaches out of their NSB. But we also know from experience, and evidence tells us that not all schools have sufficient finances to recruit part-time coaches, and that not all schools opt for having part-time coaches. And there are many reasons for that, and we can go in those reasons later if the participants wish to go in more detail. If we look at if we try to zoom in on the prevalence, and we see that multigrade schools are more prevalent in primary schools. That is largely because primary schools face more institutional constraints than, let's say, elementary schools and higher secondary schools in the province. For instance, primary schools are likely to have less allocation in terms of NSB, and also teacher shortages are more likely to be prevalent in primary schools as compared to elementary and higher schools. Also, we see that multigrade teaching is more prevalent in rural areas as compared to urban areas. A predominant reason for that is that the enrollment in rural schools is considerably lower than the enrollment in the urban schools. And if we look at the gender disaggregated data, we see that the problem is prevalent in both the girls and the boys' schools. We also tried to find out the teachers' perception and preparedness, and we find that teachers and head teachers, they both believe that each class should have a designated teacher, and they also believe that multigrade teaching is more demanding, and teachers to be dealing with 2 grades at the same time when other teachers are dealing with 1 class at one time. But they also appreciate the financial viability aspect. So in Punjab, we have a number of instances, number of communities where the enrollment in different grade levels is very low. That is sometimes it's because of low population density, and sometimes it's because of other socioeconomic constraints of the community. So it is very common to come across different classrooms. At grade 4 level, we might have 10, 15 students, and in grade 5, we might have 10, 15 students. So teachers and head teachers feel that it would not make a whole lot of financial sense to have 2 different teachers for these 2 different grades, and multi-grade teaching might be a better solution in these situations. As Dr. Angela also mentioned, that there are many advantages that many of the developed countries associate with multi-grade teaching, but that is not the case at home. Teachers and head teachers generally associate more burden with multi-grade teaching and are very less likely to highlight the benefits associated with it. Teachers and head teachers also believe that multi-grade teaching can work in within some limits. So for instance, they said that it's fine if we group together 2 grades and if we have 40 to 45 students, but if we go beyond that, for example, we have 3 grades, 4 grades, and more than 40 students, then it becomes very difficult, and the quality of teaching and learning is likely to suffer. And then we also looked at the trainings teachers, but it should be emphasized here that these were not full-fledged multigrade trainings. In fact, these were ongoing trainings in which multigrade teaching had a small component. So teachers received induction training, promotion link training, and PD, in which multigrade teaching, training on multigrade teaching was a part of. Generally, teachers find these trainings relevant, but they also think that these trainings are sort of generic and do not address more important questions, such as how do we allocate time to two different classes in a way that it is beneficial for both classes, and how do we complete the syllabus and deliver the curriculum for two different grade levels within 1 year. So these are some of the aspects which teachers think that these trainings have been lacking in. And then teachers also think that, for instance, teachers think that they don't have lesson plans which can guide them on how to introduce and carry forward a given topic which is relevant to both grades, and then that a lesson plan can help them deliver the distinct SLOs for the same topic to two different grades. So by and large, teachers find that they do not have adequate support material. If we look at the practices and processes within the classroom, we see that by the teacher is the same as Dr. Angela referred earlier. We found a higher incidence of quasi-monograde, in which teacher essentially treat two different classes as if they're teaching one grade. So for instance, if we have grade 4 and grade 5 sitting in a single classroom, the activities typically look like that first teachers are going to spend 15, 20 minutes introducing a topic. They will assign individual work to grade 4 students. They'll move on to grade 5, and they'll spend 15, 20 minutes introducing the topic, and then assign individual work, come back to grade 4. So the teacher essentially shuffles between two different grade levels. And we found considerable incidence of this approach among teachers while dealing with multigrade classrooms. And we came across these following common groupings at the classroom together, joined together, grade 4th and grade 5th, and grade 2 and grade 3 in multigrade classrooms. And generally, the trend is that teachers do not like to group together Kachi and grade 1 with other classrooms, largely because of high enrollment. They think that if a high enrollment in Kachi and grade 1 is clubbed together with another class in a multigrade classroom, that kind of creates a disaster of its own, because then teachers have to deal with the classroom disciplining most of the time than delivering the content. These are the classroom groupings which are derived by the scheme of studies, but we find that it's not all the time that classroom groupings are driven by scheme of studies. There are many instances when groupings are driven by convenience. So for instance, we came across many classrooms where the enrollment in grade 2 was very low, 5, 6 students. So these were grouped together with grade 5, or we came across classrooms where grade 1 was sitting with classroom grade 4 and grade 5. So convenience also seemed to drive the classroom groupings in most of the times. So if we look at the distribution of instruction time, we see that there are different ranges according to the teachers. Some say that we distribute 50% time to lower grade, 50% time to higher grade. And then some teachers say that we allocate higher time to higher grade. And then there are other teachers who say we allocate more time to lower grades. And then teachers have their own reasons why they do one and not the other. And we can discuss that if the participants are interested in that. And then we see that generally summative assessments across all grades are same. Summative assessments for different grades are different because assessments are driven by curriculum. And since we have different curriculum streams for different grades, the assessments are also different. So we have different grade 4 assessment at the end of different assessment at grade 5 at the end of grade 5. We found that the use of group activities was relatively rare. Teachers focus more on individual assignments and individual activities. And then we also found that group activities were rare in 2 respects. So we found little evidence for grouping together of students from the same grade, but we also found that there is even rarer incidents of groups where the students from lower grades were grouped together with students from higher grades. And then we also saw that same material which is being used for monograde classrooms was being used for multi-grade classroom, because we have presently we do not have any bench at classroom level. So the material which is being normally used for monograde classrooms is being used for multi-grade classrooms as well. So if we summarize our key takeaways, we talked about multigrade having high incidence in the province, but at the same time, we do not have sufficient data on the the data does not guide us on the incidence and prevalence, but we have proxy indicators guiding us. And then we do not have benchmarks related to material and learning environment. So schools do not have grouped together in multi-grade classroom, which grades should be joined together, and how many students at max a class should have in a multi-grade setting. And then we have curriculum and curriculum materials, which are predominantly designed for monograde classrooms without making them more responsive for multi-grade classrooms. And then our teachers require considerable support. And then we also discussed that schools are carrying out summative assessment, but there is very limited focus on formative assessments. And here are some of the moot points that we would request our esteemed panelists to share their thoughts and their reflections. So what are some of the governance and policy issues surrounding multi-grade classrooms, especially those due to which multi-grade as a phenomena has not been able to acquire adequate policy space? We discussed that we do not have sufficient data because of because of that, the multi-grade classrooms do not have visibility in our existing data collection and evidence generation systems that we have in place. And then what can be done to make the curriculum and curriculum materials more responsive to the needs of multi-grade classrooms. And so far we have been discussing multi-grade largely as a challenge in Punjab, but could it be that multi-grade can be used as an opportunity in the province? After all, we have evidence, and Dr. Angela also spoke about that, that many countries have used multi-grade as an opportunity, as a pedagogical approach to improve the learning outcomes amongst. If we go that route, what is the kind of training and support that our teachers require? And are there any alternative approaches that our teachers can draw from and incorporate those those approaches in their teaching and learning in multi-grade classrooms? And then finally, what are some of the preconditions for success that should be in place before the reform agenda or interventions can be rolled out by the school education department to have maximum impact? So we, for example, we presently have a situation in Punjab where teachers, head teachers, and education managers are not very confident about multi-grade teaching as a policy option that can deliver quality education. education, any reform agenda is undertaken. So what are some other preconditions and factors that can enable the environment for multi-grade reforms? That's it for this presentation. I thank you all for your patience and for your interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shyam sir, for highlighting the situation of multi-grading in Punjab. The situation, I believe, warrants a quick and comprehensive response to address the multi-grade challenge. But what should be the response? Why we should focus on a particular response, and how do we think that would be beneficial begs further probe and a dedicated dialogue. For this, we have requested an expert panel which has a good grip on the challenge, are aware of the local landscape, and also have years of experience in the education sector. The panel will discuss the multi-grade phenomena, why it is relevant, and how to respond to the challenge. The panel discussion will be moderated by Dr. Irfan Muzaffar, a well-known education expert having led and researched various reform efforts in Pakistan and abroad, especially from a teaching and learning point of view. He is currently the technical director at the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Education Sector Program. I'll now request Dr. Irfan to kindly start with the panel discussion. Shyam sir, if you can kindly remove your screen from sharing.
Okay, thank you, Abdullah, in the audience to today's panel discussion on the subject of this very exciting subject of multi-grading in Punjab. Let me introducing our esteemed panelists first, and then we will get into the discussion. Our first panelist is Ms. Ambreen Arif. Ambreen has more than 20 years of experience in education. Her work includes teaching, teacher education, policy advice between different stakeholders in education, including federal and provincial governments, and international development partners. Her main area of interest and expertise is education policy and governance, early childhood education, and teacher management. She has worked on a diverse set of programs across basic and higher education, including implementing education in emergency situations. And she has experience in several countries spanning in South Asia and Africa. Ambreen is currently working as education advisor with Ministry of Federal Education and Professional Training. In this position, she has been in the forefront of the federal ministry's response to COVID-19. She has led the creation of digital learning opportunities, including a tele-school, e-Taaleem, digital portal, It's a Lot, and radio school initiative, all to help students continue to learn during their school. Over to hear from Ambreen. Let me first introduce the rest of the panelists before having you speak, Ambreen. Our second speaker is Mr. Bilal Ahmed. Bilal is a senior education management reform and institutional development practitioner. He brings to this discussion a rich experience of association with education in various roles for the last 20 years. He has also led teaching and learning function in large technical assistance projects for provincial education departments in Pakistan. This was mainly in KP and currently in Punjab. Bilal is currently leading the teaching and learning component of I-SAPS, Punjab Education Sector Program, as it's called. Our third speaker is Mr. Riaz Kamlani. Riaz is currently the Executive Vice President with the Citizens Foundation, commonly known as the TCF in Pakistan. A word about TCF. TCF is a non-profit organization. As such, it is one of the largest privately owned not-for-profit networks of low-cost formal schools anywhere in the world. The foundation operates 1,652 school units at the moment, enrolls nearly 300,000 children, and has over 17,000 employees. In his current role, Riaz is responsible for leading the teams that work on program design and on initiatives that seek to deepen the impact of PCF's work beyond PCF. Riaz has also served as the chairperson of Punjab Examination Commission and represents PCF at the National Curriculum Council, which is chaired by the Federal Minister for Education in Pakistan. Our fourth speaker, Ms. Saima Anwar, is a senior education advisor at Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, which was formerly called DFID. Here she provides policy leadership, technical input and oversight for FCDO's education portfolio in Pakistan. During her time at FCDO, Ms. Anwar has led the KP and Punjab education sector programs, which have been two of FCDO's largest education programs anywhere in the world. Her special interests include education policy, planning, as well as teaching quality. So these are our esteemed speakers for today's conversation. I do not need to set the stage further after the two excellent presentations that we've just heard. So let me briefly lay out the rules for the panel. We have a total of 40 minutes for the entire panel discussion. I've already taken about 6 out of these 40 minutes, which means each of our panelists can speak for about 7 to 8 minutes. I will alert the panelists a minute before they're about to use up their time. And I request the audience to save all their questions for the panel until the plenary discussion that we have planned after the panel, right after the panel. So let me begin by inviting Ms. Amreen to speak about the policy and governance issues that underpin the multi-grading challenges in our schools and how schools and teachers respond to them. Amreen.
Thank you very much, Irfan. I will start by saying that unfortunately we are when we are blind to multi-grade situation in Pakistan. The reason I say that is that when we look at data, there are more than 60% of schools across Pakistan, and this is a phenomena in Sindh, in Balochistan, much more so in the rural areas of Sindh and Balochistan than in Punjab. But majority of the schools we find are multi-grade. But Pakistan's education system has been in a crisis for a very, very long time. And despite all the reform efforts, and some of them actually very sophisticated, undergoing for the past 10 years or so, we haven't seen a lot of changes in the education indicators. Many times I think that Pakistan's education sector is a target board and we keep throwing darts at it. Koi hit ho jata hai, koi miss ho jata hai. So we have the hits and misses that we have been dealing with. And the reason I say that is because policy making reform does not connect with the situation at the ground level. I do not fully agree with Ihtisham when he says we don't have data. I think we have lots and lots of data, but we haven't really categorized that data to use it properly. We don't have proper data analysis. When I compare the education information that comes in Punjab through the PMIU, through the MEAs, in Sindh through their real-time school monitoring system, there's a huge amount of data that tells you exactly where the school is located. It tells you exactly how many teachers are there, but we haven't sort of probably done a proper data mining or a data analysis. So we don't have our policy and reform matching what the field level situation is. We know that there are many schools that exist, and again, Abdullah said children who are in a multi-grade situation are somehow at a disadvantage. I would disagree, because they are at a disadvantage because we haven't been able to cater for them. They're not at a disadvantage just by being in a multi-grade classroom. So we have to look at what are the policy issues, and I'm so glad that this session has been conducted to look at it, to talk about it, because I'm assuming that then this will lead to some concrete field level solutions for multi-grade situations. We have more than 18 million children across Pakistan who are out of school, and not having multi-grade as a solution to address the out of school issue is not something that I think will be possible, especially because of cost efficiency issues, cost constraint issues. There are huge financial implications to moving towards a monograde situation for Pakistan, especially for communities that are very small. Although some multi-grade is just bad management and bad data usage. When I was working in Sindh in 2011, we were looking at the data, and we discovered in one of the talukas of Tharparkar district, in one small village of Wauri Dora, there were 50 multi-grade schools, literally a few feet apart from each other. And this is a situation, this is one of the extreme examples that I quote, but there are similar examples in Punjab, in KP, where you have these small schools that are co-located together, and one could sort of combine them together or consolidate them together to have a better school, a better holistic school. But unfortunately, because of bad management, we are unable to bring them together. And primary schools are not the only ones that have a multi-grade situation. In Balochistan, Sindh, I have seen middle level schools that also have a multi-grade situation. So you're also looking at grade 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, even up to the secondary level that may need to be treated in a multi-grade situation. Another anecdote that would tell you how policy and a few years ago, during the Michael Barber roadmap era, there was an exercise that was done to make lesson plans for all teachers of Punjab, and it was assumed that if we give all teachers a lesson plan in their hand, quality of learning will improve. When I was making my field visit, one of the teachers asked me, the lesson plans that you are making are for single classrooms. Am I supposed to give 24 lessons in a day? Because I have 3 classes, I have a multi-grade school, and these are individual lesson plans. So the whole policy of teacher training, learning materials does not match the field level situation. I think in Punjab, we can easily look at the data and not be blind to the field situation. And that is what I feel that can help and improve the situation. Angela, in her presentation, very rightly pointed out that we have to look at how curriculum addresses multi-grade situation, how the teacher learning material that we are providing to teachers, and teacher training that is given to the teachers. Even timetabling, if you look at a timetable in any typical school you walk in, the timetable is built around a monograde kind of a situation, assuming that there is no multi-grade. You have to develop your curriculum, your SLOs, and have to have a lens of multi-gradism in your policy making and in your reform implementation. There's a lot that has been presented in the first presentation, where we've looked at different models of multi-grade. So I think the solutions are already out there. We just need to remove that blindness that we have to our field situation and address it in a way that it assess children, it changes the way how we train teachers, and it changes the way how we make our textbooks for the multi-grade situation. I think it's a very good solution for Pakistan, and it is a solution that we cannot do away with, considering the small remote communities that we do have. But again, like I said, there are some multi-grade situations that are just bad management. Those we need to remove, and those we need to cater for. I'll end here, and I think because there's so much that has been said, one of the participants I noticed had also talked about online teaching and the COVID situation, and how multi-grade would be conducted in this kind of a situation. Unfortunately, most of the schools that are in the multi-grade situation are also the ones that are not getting the online learning. But there are offline video lesson solutions that could easily be provided to those multi-grade schools that could help them deal with multiple situations with a better pedagogy. And Punjab, with the PITB experiment, has many of those video lessons that could support a multi-grade situation. I'll stop here, and if there are any questions at the end, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Ambreen. Abdullah Sahab, can you just transfer the control to me so I can unmute myself when that's needed? Because when I try and unmute myself, it doesn't happen. Or I'll just keep myself on not mute moving forward. You will just have to bear with some background noise. Thank you very much, Ambreen. I think these are some really great insights. I think the takeaway from what you're saying is that the kind of support that we're providing to the teachers and the system in general, there seems to be a mismatch, that it doesn't really address and respond to the kind of situation that they're in. And that applies to curriculum, the timetables, the teaching and learning materials, the textbooks, so on and so forth. Now I will invite Bilal Ahmed Saab to just contextualize some of these insights in Punjab, and let's see what's really, it may be just expanding some of what has already been said by Ehtisham, but we would just like to know a little more about what's happening in Punjab.
Thank you, Dr. Irfan. Thank you, everyone, for arranging this important discussion on multigrade. And certainly, I agree with you. I would be expanding on some of the points that Sham has just spoken, and I'll be echoing some of the points that Ambreen has just talked about. Talking about multigrade incidents in Punjab, and that Sham has rightly pointed out that in about 80% plus class face the multigrade incidents, and they face that at varying levels of severity, as a matter of fact. So the magnitude and impact of multigrade teaching challenge in Punjab certainly is gigantic. And huge, that's no doubt about it. But given its seriousness, we know that we need to examine multigrade in Punjab from different dimensions, for example, financial, administrative, pedagogical, and curricular, to name a few. SED wants to eliminate multigrade teaching from Punjab. They'll have to ensure that every primary school in Punjab has at least 6 classrooms and 6 teachers. And they'll have to recruit about 60,000 more primary school teachers. And they'll have to construct more than 80,000, almost more than 80,000 new classrooms. This will not come free. You'll have to spend a lot of money on it. And the estimated amount that will have to these 80,000 odd classrooms is about 77 billion. And in order to provide salaries to these 60,000 new teachers, they'll have to add about 20 billion rupees in their annual salary budget. Looking at the trends of budgetary allocation in Punjab, we know that it will be very, very hard for SED to arrange all these funds, which means that multigrade teaching incidents, therefore, will have to find solutions within the given financial constraints, as a matter of fact. Before I talk about some of the administrative challenges that Punjab is facing as far as multigrade teaching is concerned, I would like to refer to two important points that Dr. Angela talked about. One, some of the pictures that she showed in her presentation, almost all of them had the student numbers between 6 to about 20, that if the lens of camera had captured all the number of students within that given classroom, they would be about 6 to 20 students. But situation in Punjab is fairly different. We have single teacher schools with as many as 315 students. So the challenge is magnanimous. And we also have, some of the schools with 6 teachers where there is an enrollment of as low as 21 students. So the administrative challenge is that there is an irrational optimum student-teacher ratio, or so to say OSTR. And we know that this status quo is going to continue, and this is going to persist. And this will add to the difficulties faced by the policymakers, because when they come up and start making some of the policy choices between which school has to be declared as a multigrade school and which school has to continue as a monograde school, they will not be able to really use OSTR data, because there is irrational distribution all over. At the academic and technical front, resolving multigrade challenge in Punjab might mean that we'll have to build the capacity of teachers, and we'll have to provide high quality teaching and learning materials to these teachers. And a lot of efforts certainly have gone into, Ambreen has just talked about some of the lesson plans which were developed in Michael Barber era. And unfortunately, all of them were focused at monograde teaching scenario. Yes, we know that. But the good news is that, yes, there is a culture and there is an incidence of developing these materials. So the need is to capitalize on all that. So while developing these solutions, we'll have to take the pedagogical and curricular dimensions of the issue in view. And it also requires working on the behaviors of teachers, I would say. So like other multigrade teaching contexts in the world and in Pakistan, teachers in Punjab do not use, as rightly pointed out by Sean as well, they do not use multigrade teaching as a preferred pedagogical approach. They rather take it as a burden, because they have to deal with different grade levels, and they have to sometimes teach different subjects at one time, for which they have to adjust their teaching strategies very frequently. And the situation for them within the classroom gets really worsened. In the given situation, on the attitudes, behaviors, and skills of teachers, and train them on using new ways to teach, as a matter of fact. Now, coming to some of the possible policy level solutions and other solutions, I would say that there are a few key considerations which must be kept in view while developing the policy for this huge phenomenon. First of all, I would like to suggest that the policy should create space to introduce multigrade teaching as a preferred pedagogical option, and Dr. Angela has pointed out in her presentation in the beginning as well. This would require the development and implementation of parameters for identifying multigrade teaching schools. And I would propose that policy recommendations must be based on evidence from international best practices, as a matter of fact. And the possible parameters could be school teachers and classrooms in a school. They could be the geographical location of a school. It's in a really remote area, it's in rural setting, and an urban setting, it's in semi-urban, semi-rural, so on and so forth. The second point that I would like to suggest is the policy should also provide basis for clustering different grades. This, in my view, must be based on widely accepted evidence on effective multigrade teaching pedagogical designs and vertical curricular integration. And then the third point that I would like to make is the multigrade policy should be aligned with other policies. This is something very important in the context of a public sector system, because at places, different policies, they start kind of playing against each other. So they should be aligned with other policies within SED. For instance, teacher posting and transfer and financial resource allocation for construction of made responsive to multigrade teaching recommendations. And last point that I would like to make is this is about development and training of teachers. So a CPD program which is responsive to multigrade teaching should be developed and launched immediately. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bilal Saab. In the interest of time, I think we should move right away into Riaz Kamlani Saab's talk. He also seems to have a presentation to share with us. Over to Riaz Kamlani Saab.
Absolutely. Thank you for giving this opportunity. Let me quickly put on the slideshow so that this doesn't take much time. Irfan Saab, if you could confirm that the slides are visible. Wonderful. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim ji. I would not endeavor to repeat a lot of what has been said. This is a significant issue. This is a countrywide issue. I think the conversation that we would like to talk about is much more around what are the solutions? What does it look like in terms of possibilities? And here what we bring to you is a particular example that TCF has been working on over the last few months. One would have hoped that we could have brought you about 10 to 12 months of practice, but given the COVID circumstances that we've all gone through, what would have been 10, 12 months of practice has turned out to be 3 or 4. But nevertheless, there are some findings here which might be helpful for a lot of practitioners on things that could be possible. So where has TCF worked this out? We worked this out in the schools that are with our PSSP network, in the Public School Support Program done by the Government of Punjab. TCF has adopted over 250 schools, and we have over 300 classrooms which are multi-grade classrooms. And that's what we have dived in as a practitioner to see what can be done to improve those. What was the exact dimension of the challenge? We had several, KG and 1s, for example, one clustering combination. There would be clustering combination with 2 grades or 3 grades that came across. So we had 17 of such structures in play. And there was quasi-monograde going on. So that was the reality, which essentially led to either student time, as Dr. Angela spoke about, that one group is taught first while the others wait and then the teacher turns around. And what that also leads for a diligent teacher, it leads to a double load in terms of lesson planning responsibility. So that was the reality that we saw on the ground, and that was a challenge that we've tried to do something about. In our endeavor to do something about it, our first base was to reach out across the world to understand what is best practice. We read 60 plus academic articles, reviewed manuals which have been done on that, talked to global experts, including Dr. Angela. Our team has been reaching out to her, and she's been very generous with her time. Our team conducted field visits. We saw some experiences of the Colombia and India, which we talked about, but also within the Pakistan context, small scale experiences in Chitral and Sindh, we also referred back to that. The upshot from all of those, MTD classrooms can perform at par with, if not better than, monograde counterparts with different practices in different really well or even slightly better. And I would again not stress much more on that because many speakers have talked about it. What were the specific things that research told us do work? Student-led classrooms work. Some limitations on classroom size help. You need to have independently paced material in student trackers. So various students, depending on their own trajectory, can work on the same materials at their own pace. You require differentiated learning materials for different kind of groups and different kind of ages that come through within the same class. There is a clear role for group work and peer tutoring. It is not just about the teacher. The teacher is not the only facilitator. Every student, and reduce the burden on the teacher. Scripted lesson plans help because they allow a teacher to navigate through. So these were the things that stood out for us in our research, that these are the particular elements with multigrade teaching that work particularly for our context. So we set up a pilot, and what we said, the objectives are very clear. We want to improve teaching. We want to increase active learning time for the students. We want to reduce the teacher's planning load. We want, within our context, and not just the outside world, but also within the TCF's own organization context, we want to differentiate for and improve the perception of MG, because it's always often considered a poor man's compromise. How did you to analyze pilot findings for policy recommendations? So with those objectives in mind, what did we do? We firstly looked at all of these global models and we tried to adapt whatever we could to our PSSP context. In the first pilot, what does that specifically mean? We took 3 grade clusters, which were very predominant in terms of enrollment as well as in terms of the syllabi combinations. That was KG and grade 1 was one combination, 2 and 3 was the other, and 4 and 5 was the third. So of the 17, we chose these 3, which would solve the issue for a large number of students. And then capacity, whatever we developed at a school level. So these were the things which happened at a broad program design end. But what did change look like on the ground? 5 things which changed. The first 2 were more around the planning part. Curriculum mapping changed. So SLOs were identified, similar SLOs were clubbed, so that you had a structure of SLOs through which you can actually plan your curriculum. Based on that structure, what we came up with were specific unit and lesson plan templates, and we adapted and developed those. So a curriculum mapping and then specific lesson plan development and unit plan development around that. What changed teachers in class was firstly time management. There was a different timetable that was made. And so to speak, we created more free time for the teachers. By free, we mean other students playing a part in peer learning and teacher being free to supervise, to plan, and to help students practice. Space and resources were seen differently. So these classrooms were set to facilitate interaction amongst peers and student-led learning. So the physical spacing of the classroom changed. We created resource corners to facilitate independent learning so that a student can be on his or her own. There were specific practitioner strategies identified: how to manage space, how to manage resources, how to manage group work, how to manage behavior. So specific practices for teachers on the ground on how to do this. Just would like to share with you a lens on where we were and where we are. So if I share with you a first very brief video on this particular video has 4 grades, 2 teachers. Each grade is being taught distinctly, and you can see English, maths happening at the same point in time, some independent work which is around rote learning. Let's have a look. So here you could see that the clusters that are happening, teachers trying to engage and trying their best to engage with a couple of student groups, but there were 3 or 4 different ones. Independent work typically means rote learning. There are student groups which are typically idle and not doing or not engaged in a meaningful way. What that could look like in terms of a different reality is this particular one, where we now have these lesson plans in play. There are 2 groups that are working together on an SST, on social studies lesson on timelines. A lens of what this could look like, and these are very early days, but there you go. So here what you see is that all individuals are specifically engaged. There are no, the students will continue to work on the task even if the teacher is not directly addressing them. And that's one specific vision that could emerge from multi-grade teaching. But as I said earlier, these are very early days. Our preliminary findings coming from these few months of experience is that field teams are reporting a marked improvement in lesson delivery because teachers have a frame which they can follow. We have Sahi as an independent evaluator going to our schools. They've observed teacher trainings, they've conducted teacher surveys. It's very early days, but the broad stroke findings that are coming up is that for most of the teachers, this was the first time that they were formally trained multi-grade teachers. It was the first time that they went through it and they have found it to be quite beneficial, number one. Number two, the unified lesson plans. Amreen spoke about it, that a class which has 3 different groups and 3 different lesson plans. She can't figure it out. So a lesson plan which has been figured out for her has really helped her manage the class rather than focus on the planning. My last slide on what we see here. We see potential. These are very early days, but we see the global context. We see lots of good practice, but here is a solution that is homegrown based on those learnings. If we can do this right, we see 2 particular possibilities. Number one, there's 40% of public primary schools which have multi-grading across the country. There could be a significant improvement in quality for those 28 million kids who are in schools. For the 22 million who are out of schools, suddenly as a country, we won't have unlimited financial resources. This could be one solution that could help bring them to schools and address them in a way that is also economical, but which really delivers a good quality of education for these children. Thank you, Fansa, for your time and for I-SAPS providing the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Riyasab. I will move right into the last speaker, Saima. Saima, the first 2 speakers spoke about the crises, but one also sees opportunity in multigrading in what is described by Riyasab. But the policy and programmatic responses so far to multigrading in nearly everywhere in Pakistan, as Amreen has also mentioned, have remained fragmented and piecemeal. So it would be good if you could, based on your experience, help the audience reflect on the nature of response that is needed, both in terms of policy as well as practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irfan. I've listened to some really interesting speakers, and a lot of what I was planning on highlighting has already been said, so I don't want to repeat all of that. I mean, that's having so many like-minded people on this panel is something that really attracted me to it. But the main point that I was going to start with and make is what Professor Angela already said, is really around the opportunity that the multi-grade teaching pilot that Riaz just spoke about to me, what is most interesting about this is the opportunity that it offers to us to look beyond some of the immediate challenges and the short-term fixes, and to look at its wider benefits, which is improving teaching and learning. Because we know that this is responding to a very important policy challenge, which is to improve or to augment student learning outcomes. And this is an issue we know not just in Pakistan, but many other places. So that's one thing. The fact that it focuses so heavily on improvements to curriculum and to teaching is also appealing and attractive, because all of the international literature and the evidence that we have tells us that the one factor that has probably the most or the highest impact on improving student learning outcomes is changing the way teachers teach, which is what this approach is trying to do. So there's definitely a case for at least looking at and experimenting with differentiated approaches to teaching and learning, which might be applicable both to multigrade and monograde settings. As people before me have already said, this offers a complete package of support, which includes curriculum, very high quality learning resources. I want to reinforce the point that Dr. Angela made. I think the key really here is the work that this does with on the curriculum and the resources. and then the assessment. I just want to narrow down perhaps, one point that I could highlight, which is probably not been said, is, want to focus on the point of, while there are so many key ingredients to the success of this approach, as other speakers before me have highlighted, I would like to focus on one in particular, which I think is the most significant, which is government leadership and teacher adoption. And there, I really want to talk about one particular example, which I'm sure most of the people on this call will already probably be familiar with, which is the teaching at the right level. So all of these are, very similar approaches that trying to innovate in terms of teaching. Because we know, learning outcomes, it's a very ambitious ask, but we know that when the government leads and the majority of the teachers adopt a program like this, significant impacts on learning are possible. And here, I think what we need to do is we need to understand government's priorities. We need to amplify the ideas of champions. We need to make good use of country-specific evidence, which we are trying to do here in Punjab. We also need to understand teachers' needs and what they say about the existing barriers to improve teaching. Because any program that is designed without consulting teachers or without understanding the ground realities, as Amreen said earlier, will have very little chances of success. One of the things, with such programs that I've come across also is that we should consider the level of difficulty of any new pedagogical approaches for the teacher, because a program that teachers consider too complex will have, very little chances of being implemented consistently. So with that, this one example of teaching at the right level, which has, piloted and rigorously evaluated over several years, basically is a kind of sort of a differentiated approach to teaching. This program went through several different iterations before it could be successfully implemented at scale within a government system. And so it's a long sort of description, which I won't go into, but just very briefly, what I want to say is that although teachers believed that the methods proposed here were effective, were interesting, they did not think that adopting them was part of their core responsibility. They thought that this was something additional, which was coming on top of the regular job, and their main job was to basically to cover the curriculum or complete the syllabus that was mandated by the government. So eventually what happened and what changed and what led to the success of this program was that, a system of academic leaders was established within the government to guide and supervise the teachers. And a lot of those sort of preconditions we already have in Punjab. We don't need to set this up anew. And the second thing is that the government mandated that all schools add an extra hour of instruction to the school day to implement this new approach. So this sent the signal really that the program was fully supported and implemented by the government, and eventually that was critical to its success. So just quickly wrapping up, perhaps, at the risk of sort of repeating what others have said, some of the things that we know already from the evidence that we have, this multi-grade or differentiated approach to learning, what some also call the multi-level teaching approach, is proven to work in classrooms with students of varying abilities. It allows students to acquire foundational skills that we all know are so critical for future life and learning. And it has the potential also to reduce the strong divide between formal and non-formal education. Speakers before me have referred to that also. And this focus on learning for all is particularly appealing in the context of Pakistan, where we have a large number of out-of-school children, with a significant number of them being overage for their grade, for instance. Some of the things, perhaps where we need to explore further is that, this is a response that holds the promise of being locally relevant, because it is locally relevant, has the promise of being providing stronger community engagement and ownership. I also heard, one of the questions I had was, yes, this is a model that is suited to rural settings, but may also be applied to overcrowded and poorly resourced schools in urban areas. I heard someone say that this is already the case. And again, we heard that while this has been tested quite a lot at the elementary school level, because that is where most of the challenges are, it also has potential to be developed and applied to secondary school. So like any new approach, there are challenges inherent in this, a few which usually make it a non-starter during policy conversations. One of the things is, obviously the structure of the school, which is fixed and it's just graded, because of which other alternative approaches remain invisible. Secondly, there are issues to do difficulties in differentiated teaching, especially when teachers' capacity is also an issue. But we've seen that there are ways to address this. And thirdly, the other sort of challenge is classroom size. We've seen that approaches such as this work better in classrooms with smaller numbers, but can also work in larger numbers. So just to sum up, we definitely know that there is strong evidence on alternative methods of teaching. We know that they work. I think there is a need to contextualize this in our context in Punjab, in Pakistan, which we're trying to do through this program. And so the question that I would leave you with, which is a question for all of us, is how do we bring all of these practices together and experiment in the public sector, working within the constraints of the system, because the benefits of doing this are really enormous. So I'll stop there. Yes, thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Saima. I think we have plenty of inputs from all of our panelists, and you've summed it up really very well. We need experimentation, but within the constraints that we have in our system. I'll just very quickly sum up some of the highlights from that has come from the points that have been made by different panelists, and then we can jump right into the QA time. So the first highlight is that multigrade is not right for every school. It has come up in the presentations as well, and in the early presentations, as well as what Bilal mentioned, size matters. Amreen also said that. So there is good value for money if multigrading is done in small size school. Now, is that something that we all agree with? And this is a question that I would like to pose to Dr. Angela Little as well. Doing well in multigrade does not depend merely on building teachers' capacity alone. We need to change the way curriculum is organized and how the school timetable is structured and so many other things. There is opportunity in changing the way we think about organizing teaching in the classroom, vertical alignment of timetables, mixed ability groupings, alternative teaching approaches such as what Saima just mentioned, teaching at the right level, should be fully explored and experimented with to develop a comprehensive response to multigrade situation. With these highlights, let us move into the QA time. Over to you, Abdullah sir.
Thank you so much to all the panelists for such an interesting and informed discussion. This is extremely useful as we move toward devising a policy, a response to the situation. We have some time for the audience reflection and feedback. Kindly use the raise hand option if you have anything to say. If your question is from a specific expert, please name them. Otherwise, I'll request Irfan Saab to allocate it to the most relevant expert. In the interest of time, I would request to kindly keep your question or reflection short and to the point.
If there is no question yet.
Yeah, so we have one question from Ms. Michelle. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for such an insightful session. My question is from Dr. Angela. My question is that the teaching time becomes half in multigrade teaching, multigrade classrooms. So how should we address this challenge of half time available to the students?
Shall I take that now?
I think if we have any other question, let me see, or so you can respond to this one, and then we'll move to Ms. Neha. Dr. Angela, if
Sorry,
you could respond, please.
Are you asking?
Yeah, please.
Yes, of course. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I think that in many classrooms, the teacher time is halved if they're adopting the monograde strategy. Not necessarily, though, because it depends how attentive the teacher is to the students that she's not teaching directly at that time. If she has taught them and she has left them with a well-constructed task to get on with, then the teaching time is, well, the teaching time might be halved, from her point of view, but the learning time is not halved. The learning time is potentially as much as in an ordinary monograded classroom. The other answer to your question is that I think that you've described the extreme case of multigrade, which is where the teacher does indeed just treat the children as though they were monograded, and where she pays no attention to the children that she's not in direct eye contact with, as it were. In the differentiated strategies, she may be attending to some children, but she has in the meantime set tasks, or indeed the textbooks and the workbooks have indicated the tasks that the children must proceed with. And so the learning time is certainly not halved. And I think that's the challenge we have to face, is how to ensure that our learners are engaged in learning for as much time as possible.
Thank you so much, Dr. Angela. We'll take 3 questions. First, let's start with Ms. Neha Rahil.
Thank you, and thank you to all the panelists for your insights. My question is specifically about the new single national curriculum in Pakistan, and whether any of you believe that that presents challenges or opportunities to enhancing multi-grade teaching and learning. Because as we heard a lot about curriculum being the starting point, so then why wasn't this curriculum the starting point? Or if it is, please enlighten us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Neha. Mr. Haider Ali.
Well, my question is from Mr. Riaz Kalmani. Your pilot is in PSSP schools, where all the management and other things lies with you only. How confident you are that it would work in public sector school as well? I mean, is it your pilot is generalized enough that we can implement on public schools also?
Thank you so much, Mr. Haider. Ms. Sabah Arshad.
Thank you, Abdullah sir. First, I would like to congratulate I-SAPS team for bringing this together, and thank you, the panelists, for this insightful discussion. I just have a quick question. We have seen that in international context, this multigrading is taken as an opportunity, and it works for many contexts. My question is, like, what are the key issues within Pakistan, like why it's not working here? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Fan, if you could kindly allocate, the first one was regarding the SNC, I think.
I think Ambreen is the best person to respond to that question. Ambreen?
So very honestly, the curriculum is structured around student learning objectives. So if we are smart, we can look at what has been allocated grade-wise and age-wise and construct them according to what the children are supposed to learn and how they are grouped together. So for example, if a school has a multi-grade situation where grade 1 and 2 students are grouped together in one classroom, then the teacher needs to look at what are the learning outcomes that are expected at the end of the year and then structure the lessons. So although the curriculum is not structured in a multi-grade manner, but good educationists can pick up that curriculum and use it for a multi-grade situation very easily. The problem is that we are not using our curriculum and not applying it to the multi-grade situation. Punjab will definitely need to develop teacher and learning material and address the learning assessments of children accordingly. Will not inhibit it, but if not structured properly, then obviously it will be an issue.
I would just like to add to what Ambreen has just said. So I think curriculum is what it is, as Ambreen has also mentioned. I think what's important, what can be done is that when you plan instruction and plan timetables and academic calendars, that you bring things together in a way that then can be made use of in a multi-grade classroom. At some point, I think on this particular question, we should also invite a comment from Dr. Angela Little on how a curriculum which is not meant per se for multigrade can be turned into something that can be used in multigrade.
Thank you. I think that the fact that the curriculum is currently structured around learning objectives and learning outcomes is a very good start. But I think these probably, and maybe this has already happened, these need to be broken down into many, many smaller levels. And I think they will have, it's helpful in the reorganization and restructuring of curriculum to think about progress from the point of view of the individual child, to think about the idea of once you've achieved this, then you move on to that, but to build into those curriculum tasks the idea of formative assessment. I know that a mention was made about the summative assessments that all the children in different grades have to go through. But I think one of the really interesting aspects of the Escuela Nueva program and the activity-based learning program that I mentioned briefly was that built into those curriculum tasks or those learning tasks, there are frequent tasks which they are actually formative assessments. They are assessing whether the child has mastered those detailed learning objectives, and if they haven't, then they need to go over the work again, or they need additional support from the student from the teacher. But once they have achieved them, then they move forward. But the children don't necessarily think of these assessments as tests or assessments. It's just another learning task. So it becomes part of their learning routine, which is often a very enjoyable thing to do. I think we all know of some of the enjoyable assessments that we find in online learning. They're fun. They're not frightening. They're not like the end of year test, which it generates a lot of anxiety. But you build assessment into your normal learning routines, so that a child might be spending a week or 2 weeks on a particular concept in mathematics, at the end of which there will be, it may just appear as another learning task, but it's actually an assessment. They can also then check against what the teacher expectation is. It does increase, I have to say, some of the recording, assessment recording requirements for teachers, but children love doing this, and children become very self-motivated and self-directed, and I think we often don't give children enough credit for what they are capable of doing in classrooms. They're also, many of them are capable of actually assessing other students on particular tasks and supporting those other students in those tasks. So when we talk about assessment and curriculum, let us not confine ourselves to thinking only about traditional summative assessment. I think that formative assessment, reorganization of curriculum and learning materials.
Thank you. Abdullah Sahab, I think the second and third question is pretty much the same question. Does it work? Can it work in the public sector schools? So, Riaz Sahab, if you could take a jab at that.
So I think the question asked by Haider Sahab is a perfectly valid one. Can it work in the public sector? And I think my first comment would be no two contexts are identical. So you have to work with some kind of a parallel between the two. So let's look at the parallel. The schools that we have in PSSP are government schools. When they were headed out under this program, they were some of the most difficult schools. So they are in some of the most difficult areas. All of the faculty are local. So we don't bring faculty from far off. They are local women from that area, very representative of what would happen in a public school. Infrastructure-wise, they are no better than any other public school. Many of them are in a far worse condition. So there are a lot of parallels there. The final thing is, will teachers work? Now, I find this contention to be almost taken as an unchallenged universal truth that teachers in public sector schools don't work. And I find that many occasions a grossly unjust conclusion to draw for a large majority of teachers. Now, with that in mind, if there are teachers in a public school in that context who are trying to teach a multi-grade classroom, and there is a frame which make their lives easier, which makes their planning, the way in which they conduct the class easier, makes their children happier, I find it surprising or difficult to understand, and why would a teacher say no to that? So if the infrastructure understanding is the same, if the community is the same, if the school is the same, there are reasonably very high parallels to be drawn. So I would logically have my hopes reasonably high to say, is there a fit there for the public sector? Probably yes. Will it universally work everywhere? Obviously no.
Thank you. Abdullah sir, if you allow, I'd just like to follow up on this. I think Sabah's question is really also answered, and we can ask her if it's not, by the answer which is given by Riaz sir. But I would just like to follow up on this and refer us back to Ehtisham Saab's slide, where he talks about preconditions for success and enabling environment for MGT. And we've also heard people talk about, and Angela has also mentioned the various kinds of pedagogical models that work really well. The question is really a very short question. Does size matter? Does the size matter? And is there a threshold that if it's crossed, you can't do multigrade really well? Angela, if you could.
Yes, I think that size does matter. I know that Bilal said that it looked as though the maximum number of students in any of the classrooms that I observed was 20. I have actually observed multigrade teaching in a Sri Lankan school where there was one teacher and 257 students, but that was a very, very extreme example. I felt extremely sorry for that poor teacher. I know that in Tamil Nadu, in the activity-based learning, they have some classes which have up to 60 students. I haven't actually seen those at work. My hunch is, and it is only a hunch, it's not based on hard and fast research. My hunch is that multigrade teaching works best for a maximum between 25 and 30 students. I would not go above 30. If the classes are going well above 30 to 40, 50, 60, the answer there is not to just push on multigrade teaching and conducted by one teacher. It is to provide another teacher. I think sometimes multigrade, I get very uncomfortable when multigrade is sometimes used as an excuse for not providing extra teachers when what you need is extra teachers. Or when multigrade is used, as Umbreen has said, that sometimes there are several schools which are co-located, very, very small schools, which could be amalgamated and where you would then get enough teachers. But size does matter, and I think for very good multigrade teaching, the smaller the better. It works extremely well as in rural areas where there is a very low density of population and very, very small maximum enrollments.
Yes, Bilal, I think you have something to say, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to, take what working with public sector teachers and their behavior and attitude towards assessment. The word assessment is intimidating, as a matter of fact. One possible alternative that probably I've been using as a teacher myself is to use a lot of practice material and setting benchmarks where I say that, okay, I have 6 or 3 or 4 practice exercises on one particular lesson. Able to do all of them with no guidance from the teacher, that means they've understood. So we might think while designing these materials of changing the formative assessment terminology for the sake of terminology to some of the practice exercises, and then set benchmarks where we could say that, okay, you've got 3-4 exercises in your toolkit, and if all of the students are able to do the 4th one with no teacher support, that means the students have understood. So probably that would help us kind of get ready data, ready information of dealing with some of the challenges. So, assessment is the talk of the town these days. So, and this is equally intimidating, So I just wanted to, talk about.
Can I come back on that point very quickly?
Sure.
Irfan, can I come back on that point?
Yes, please.
Yes. Okay. Just to say, I agree with you entirely. I mean, let's call it practice, not formative assessment, because you're right. Everyone's talking about assessment. Unfortunately, most people are talking about summative assessment, which is why I keep pushing the word formative assessment. In other words, generating information which teachers can use in a timely fashion on the spot in order to determine the next stage of teaching and learning. More generally on terminology, I think we have to find a way of rebranding multigrade. Multigrade has got, it is regarded as so second class in so many systems. Maybe we should call it multi-level teaching, or in Tamil Nadu, they got rid of the multi altogether. They just called it activity-based learning. And they managed to then ride above the multigrade monograde divide, and they managed to persuade teachers across the entire state to do it. And they persuaded teachers to change their monograded classrooms into multigraded classrooms. So there is definitely there are conceptual issues and there are presentational issues. And I would recommend strongly finding words, not necessarily words in English, but in local languages that capture the concept, but move away from the words multigrade and monograde.
Sure. Thank you so much for the discussion and reflections. We are now moving towards the close of this session. One thing is important to share here. While the multigrade challenge exists across Pakistan, Punjab is a little different from other provinces. The school education department has acknowledged the gravity of the challenge and is leading the efforts to fulfill its promise of providing level studying ground to all children by developing and implementing a policy response to facilitate teaching and learning in multigrade settings. Secretary Saab is in the field and unable to connect right now. I'll request the Honorable Special Secretary, School Education Department, to kindly share the department's stance and plans in this regard. Sir, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. That has been a very interesting discussion on the multigrade teaching. As the figures, you have seen from the figures, we are facing this challenge from the rural and as well as the urban side. There are different trends. And even the teachers, they used to migrate from the rural areas to the urban areas. And there is a high pressure for this kind of facilitating this kind of migration. And that's why we are facing crisis of the teacher in the rural areas. And what we have seen, this is the multi-grade teaching seems to be the only solution for addressing this problem. We are already having more 80,000 around teachers, which the vacant posts, and most of the posts they are in, and it is almost the 80 above 80% of our total population of the students. This kind of intervention really that will be helpful to manage our schools. We have many schools where we have only one teacher, even not two teachers. So unless we go for the training of teachers for multi-grade teaching, we cannot improve the quality of the education. And this session really, that has been one person, that is the DG Qaed as well from this session, because he would have been in a better position to bridge the gap and the learning from this session and making it part of their training for the teachers, either that is their regular trainings or some their promotion trainings. I think when these recommendations are codified, we will be able to make them a part of our training modules, so that these different sets of multi-grade strategies, we can go for it and we can the work has been done. So what I believe, I'm thankful for all members of the panel who have contributed their expert opinion on it. And school education definitely is the biggest department of the Punjab, and in terms of human resource, in terms of our operations. And that was a real talk about the real challenge of the school education department. So what I believe from the school education department, we will definitely encourage all your recommendations.
Thank you so much, sir. It is refreshing to hear about department's prioritization to devise a coordinated and comprehensive plan to address the multi-grade teaching and learning challenge in Punjab. We also had representation from PCTB, MD PCTB was with us. We also had additional Director General Qaed. So they have been with us for all this session. There, we are hopeful that under your and Secretary Saab's able leadership, all teachers and children in multi-grade setting will have a supportive environment, and they'll be provided the requisite tools to perform at par or even better than their mono-grade counterparts. I'll briefly summarize key takeaways from today's session. As we move forward, we need to, number one, develop a robust and comprehensive multi-grade teaching and learning policy that facilitates the teaching and learning process in multi-grade settings. Number two, we need to review and update existing data collection mechanisms so that multi-grade classrooms have greater visibility to inform interventions as guided by the multi-grade policy. We need to make curriculum and curriculum materials more responsive to multi-grade classrooms. Fourthly, align existing teacher training programs to equip teachers for multi-grade classrooms. Last but not the least, pilot multi-grade teaching as an instructional and pedagogical approach in public sector schools. With this, we'll close today's sessions. We are grateful to all of you for joining us today and participate in the discussions. Looking forward to having you with us in future deliberations and discussions as well. We are also grateful to the experts and our keynote speakers to find time for the webinar and contribute towards the cause. Thank you so much, and Allah Hafiz.